WADR, promoting dialogue.
It's 6 p.m. in Dakar, 7 p.m. in Port Novo. Good evening and many thanks for staying tuned to West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting on 94.9 FM and online on wadr.org. This is Newslink for Star Headlines. Pressure mounts for a concrete consensus in Niger's National Conference on Transitional Charter as CSOs announce boycott.
On ne peut pas arriver à un très large consensus.
You can't reach a very broad consensus if participation isn't inclusive. You mentioned organizations, but these aren't small organizations. At the Paris Bar, we are talking about NGOs as important as Transparency International, Niger chapter.
Burkina Faso reclaims 71% of lost territories following an intensive anti-terrorist campaign.
We
achieved 89% of our targets with an occupancy rate and a territory conquest rate of around 71%. So, as far as we are concerned, we've more or less achieved our objectives.
The Ivorian state prosecutor denies claims of any political influence over the sentencing of two PPACI executives for attacking national defense, and Benin's Economic and Financial Crimes Court reviewed over 7,000 criminal cases in 5 years. Please stay tuned for details of these stories and more.
Here is Abdullahi Hassan with Newslink.
Many thanks for joining our broadcast and welcome to our listeners within and outside the sub-region. Tonight, Newslink begins in Niger as the nation's capital from tomorrow Saturday hosts stakeholders under one roof for the much talked about National Conference on the Transition Charter. The confab organized by the CNSP will run until Wednesday, February 19. The discussion, which will take place in a tense political and security context, excludes political parties and groups. For their part, several other civil society organizations have also decided to boycott the national dialogue. They denounced the lack of inclusiveness of the process and questioned the framework set by the authorities. With just a few hours before the national conference opens, the thought of reaching a strong consensus when several socio-political organizations are not included arouses concern. Sadiq Kaba, a journalist and political and security analyst from Niger, shares his insight.
On ne peut pas arriver à un très large consensus.
You can't reach a very broad consensus if participation isn't inclusive. You mentioned organizations, but these aren't small organizations. At the Paris Bar, we are talking about NGOs as important as Transparency International, Niger chapter. It's the former president of the Republic, Maman Ousmane. We've learned who's not going. So if we don't succeed in achieving inclusive participation, it's obvious that we won't be able to get a large part of Niger society to endorse the results of these meetings. For example, one of the most important facts we observed was the absence of political parties. The national conferences were held to prepare Niger for a return to democracy and civilian rule. If we don't involve the parties beforehand, I don't see how the parties are going to feel concerned by the results of these meetings and how they are going to govern on the basis of the results of the meetings, since the purpose of the conference is to prepare the ground for Niger's return to democracy. And we can't do a job like this if we don't involve the people who tomorrow will be the competitors, the people who will emerge from the elections that Niger will have organized. As long as participation is not inclusive, the consensus cannot be as broad as possible.
Inclusive, le consensus ne peut pas être le plus large possible.
Sadiq Kaba, a Nigerian journalist and analyst of political and security issues. Staying in the Sahel, the Burkinabe Prime Minister has launched an initiative to evaluate the members of his government. Jean-Emmanuel Drago intends to monitor the execution of projects and contracts by members of his cabinet. Briefing the Prime Minister about the state of security in the country, the Minister of National Defense clarified the rate of reconquest of national territory is at 71%. General Celestin Sempori promised to intensify the war on terrorism. Francis Boniface has won this report by WADR's Ouagadougou correspondent Martin Kaba.
One of the ministers to brief on the activities of his ministry is General Celestin Sempori, in charge of national defense. Sempori, in his midterm report submitted on Friday, said improvement has been made in theaters of operation, resulting in the reconquest of 71% of the national territory. The recaptured localities are now under state control, according to General Celestin Sempori.
We achieved 89% of our targets with an occupancy rate and a territory conquest rate of around 71%. So, as far as we are concerned, we've more or less achieved our objectives, but there is still a long way to go. The war is not over. The situation has not yet folded. Even if the terrorist groups are experiencing aggression and have been weakened in every way, logistically, even psychologically, they have been reached.
Sur le plan même psychologique, ils sont atteints. General Sempori announced that anti-terrorist operations will be stepped up in 2025. However, he is cautious about the question of the end of the war in Burkina Faso.
You know, we can't tell you when this war will end. You always have to be careful. We know when a war starts, but we can never tell you when it ends. But as far as we are concerned, we are going to fight to end it as soon as possible. That's our goal.
However, he is cautious about the question of the end of the conflict in Burkina Faso. The evaluation of the contracts of objectives began on Thursday, February 13, 2025. Several ministers have already appeared before Jean-Emmanuel Ouedraogo, including those in charge of security and humanitarian action.
A report filed in by WADR's Martin Kaba in Ouagadougou and voiced in our studios by Francis Boniface. Now, in a related development, the Beninese Minister of Justice has defended his sector from claims of unprofessional conduct and political influence in some of the cases that it resolved. An organ of the judiciary in perspective is the Court for the Repression of Economic Offences and Terrorism (CREAT). Presenting the organization's substantial numerical assessment, Beninese Minister of Justice Yvonne Dechenu described CREAT as non-partisan and has prosecuted more than 7,000 cases in the last 5 years. Imoredet has more.
The numerical assessment presented indicates that about 7,400 procedures were handled between January 2019 and December 2024. In detail, the jurisdiction handled 2,142 cases of cybercrime, 680 cases for terrorism, 157 for drug trafficking, 117 for embezzlement of public funds, 60 for corruption, and 234 for money laundering. The CREAT in Benin is responsible for specific disputes which particularly affect certain aspects of the country's economic life and security, said the Minister of Justice. The court, however, focuses more on offenses linked to organized crime, maritime piracy, terrorism, and public ethics. Defending the institution's objective of fair ruling, the Minister of Justice stated that CREAT also plans to deploy in other cities such as Porto Novo, Pubet, Malamville, Kandy, and Nichengo. The goal, according to the special prosecutor, Mario Metonu, who presented the report alongside his principal, is to cover the entire national territory. Faced with questions about the functioning of this court, Minister Dechenu recalled that the CREAT is not a separate entity that operates differently. He stressed that appointment of magistrates follows the same procedure as for other courts after the approval of the High Council of the Judiciary.
Imoredet reporting there.
More stories coming up on West Africa Democracy Radio. Newslink continues.
Remember, we're live on YouTube on WADR and on Facebook, WADR English Service. Let's take you to Côte d'Ivoire, where two executives of the opposition PPACI of former President Laurent Gbagbo have been served 10 years of prison sentence each for attack on the national defense. The sentenced executives are Damana Pikas and Kwa Justin. Providing additional information on their sentencing is Kone Brahman Omar, public prosecutor at the Abidjan court. Addressing a press conference, the public prosecutor specified that Damana Pikas is not being prosecuted because he is a politician.
Damana
Pikas was named as the financier by one of the defendants involved in the struggle and the various subversive action files. So, the elements in the file are quite convincing and attest to the fact that Damana Pikas was the financier. Kras Justin's frame of reference was September 14, 2020, the date on which the Constitutional Council was due to publish the list of candidates authorized to take part in the presidential election. That's when he tried to get his militants and supporters all fired up, asking them to prepare themselves physically and mentally and to take to the streets all over Côte d'Ivoire over an infinite period, creating chaos. And he did not deny the charges against Damana Pikas and others. Just like Fuad Justin, these are criminal acts. They are not misdemeanors, and they are particularly serious. The time for justice is not the time for politicians, and we don't get involved in political considerations. These are criminal facts that have been investigated in accordance with the rules of criminal procedure.
Now, while lawyers of Damana Pikas vowed to appeal the verdict, the leader of the PPACI, former Ivorian president, Laurent Gbagbo, alleged that the ruling was politically motivated. It should be recalled that Côte d'Ivoire is scheduled to hold its presidential election in October 2025. And now to Nigeria, the defense headquarters says it has disseminated a sizable number of terrorist and criminal gangs during recent operations in parts of the country. General Marcus Kange's briefing comes amid surging insurgency in the northeast region, an epicenter of the Boko Haram crisis. The director of media operations for the Nigerian Defense Headquarters said nearly 80 terrorists were neutralized and over 100 arrested. Weapons and equipment were also confiscated.
Land component of the armed forces conducted joint operations with Office of National Security Advisor Team, security agencies, hybrid forces, and other forces respectively. These operations include fighting and confidence-building patrols, raids, ambushes, clearance, as well as search and rescue operations. In the course of the operation, gentlemen, they neutralized several terrorists, apprehended their collaborators, rescued kidnapped victims, and received surrendered terrorists. Gun runners, oil theft collaborators, and other violent extremists were also apprehended. Joint task force that has been rejigged in the Northwest has swung into action, and they have started seeing the results. Yourself, you're also seeing the results. So much has happened in the Northwest. We have gained so much successes in the last 2 weeks in the Northwest.
General Marcus Kange is the director of media operations of the Nigerian Defense Headquarters. Before the break, let's bring you this report that captures the reaction of the Senegalese government following the publication of the report by the Court of Auditors. The document covering the management of public finances between 2019 and 2024 reveals significant irregularities in budgetary expenditures and the country's debt, which has reached nearly 100%, thus exceeding the UEMOA thresholds. The Senegalese executive now plans to implement structural measures to correct the anomalies identified by the Court of Auditors. Judicial proceedings have also been threatened against personalities from the former regime of President Macky Sall. Christopher Ticho completes the story.
The findings are bitter, according to the government. Following the publication of the report, here's Sheikh Diba, Senegalese Minister of Finance.
This report is an accurate snapshot of the country's financial situation. It highlights deficiencies that must now be rigorously and decisively addressed.
For the government, strong measures are now necessary to prevent the country's economy from collapsing.
The reform is structured around three major axes. Firstly, the strengthening of budgetary control and the management of public services. Secondly, the modernization and digitization of public finance management. Thirdly, structural reforms aimed at reorganizing the services involved in debt management.
Judicial proceedings are also being considered, according to Ousmane Dieng, Senegalese Minister of Justice.
This process will involve various individuals, including ministers, general directors, accountants, managers, and other stakeholders. The complete identification of all those responsible for these irregularities and their accountability before the competent judicial authorities is envisaged.
In response to the government, the APR, the former ruling party, rejects the conclusion of the Court of Auditors report and refers to it as manipulation.
Christopher Teacher reporting there. You are listening to Newslink here on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting from Dakar, Senegal. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Pressure mounts for a concrete consensus in Niger's National Conference on Transitional Charter as CSOs announce boycott. Burkina Faso reclaims 71% of lost territories following an intensive anti-terrorist campaign. The Ivorian state prosecutor denies claims of any political influence over the sentencing of two PPACI executives for attacking national defense. And Benin's Economic and Financial Crimes Court reviewed over 7,000 criminal cases in 5 years. Ahead in the news, we have the guest interview and sports news. Please stay with us.
West Africa Democracy Radio. It's you speaking.
Many thanks for staying with us. The Ghanaian government has announced a decision to scale down this year's Independence Day celebrations on March 6 due to rising costs. Instead of the usual grand event at Independence Square, the main ceremony will rather take place at the Presidency, the Jubilee House. Additionally, the tradition of rotating the celebrations among different regions has been paused. Addressing the press, Minister of State for Government Communications Felix Kwakye-Ofosu disclosed that the 2023 event cost 15 million Ghana cedis, an estimated $970,000, costing the government an amount the government cannot afford this time. The ceremony will now feature a limited number of guests, including chiefs, religious leaders, and school representatives, with highlights including a military guard of honor as well as an address by President John Dramani Mahama. Have a listen to the Minister of State for Government Communications, Felix Ofosu.
We discovered after some review that the rotation imposed additional costs, and therefore at a time when our national budget is severely constrained due to economic difficulties, it was not going to be sustainable to keep rotating the national celebrations. Indeed, if I were to put figures on how much it costs to hold these celebrations, you will find that depending on where the celebrations are sent, there is significant cost implications. For instance, the last celebrations that were held in Ho cost the country a staggering 15 million Ghana cedis. And every time that it has been sent to a different regional capital, apart from Accra, we've had to bear such costs. In the spirit of cutting down on government expenditure, on non-essential expenditure, President Mahama has instructed that this rotational policy be suspended. In addition to this, the main celebrations, which ordinarily would have taken place in Accra at the Independence Square, has also become the subject of some rollback. President Mahama believes that, yes, there is much to celebrate over Ghana's independence. It is perhaps the most significant happening in our entire history as a country. He believes that at this moment in time, there is a need to reprioritize government expenditure.
Ghana's Minister of State for Government Communications, Felix Kwakye-Ofosu.
Politics,
analysis on major news,
social matters, and all. This is a guest.
Our guest this evening is Agnes Tomasi, Station Director of West Africa Democracy Radio, WADR. The Station Director, who was a special guest at the just-ended African Union of Broadcasting AUB Media Climate Summit, speaks about the role of radio in combating climate change. The regional conference also served an exchange platform for stakeholders, allowing West Africa Democracy Radio the opportunity to outline its series of interventions in the fight against climate change, including training of journalists, material support, and community engagement using the radio. Agnes Tomasi, WADR Station Director, has been speaking to my colleague, Christopher Ticho.
Here in Africa, radio is the most pertinent, the most accessible. Radio is resilient. Apart from its affordability, easy to access, easy to use, it's easy to move with and everything, radio has been resilient over time. Television came and people thought radio would go. It didn't go. It stayed because it is needed. We know what happens in our countries. We know the situation in our countries, and we know that radio cannot die like that. In fact, it is not only surviving, but it is the most relevant that we're using today. Digital media came, radio is still important, it is still relevant, it is still the most accessible. In the deepest community or communities you can think about in Africa, radio remains the best channel of communication. People trust their community radios, people own their community radios, they volunteer for their community radios, and the information that comes from these community radios is not only vital to them, but is their life and livelihood. So radio is important. And what I was adding is that apart from working on daily providing quality information, and when I talk about quality, is factual information, fully verified, impartial, independent, and relevant to the lives and livelihoods of the people. Relevant to contribute to informed decisions. Because if you're well informed with the right information, then you will take a decision that will bring about change in a positive way. And I want to add that media should be supported. Africa is our own. And as African journalists, we are keen and ready to work. But how often do we have the support that we need from Africans themselves? Philanthropists from the United States, from UK, from all over the place. And we have our own philanthropists. Africa is great, like I said earlier on. Africa is great in natural resources, natural knowledge, I call it. Africa is great when it comes to the art, to culture, to everything. And we have great businessmen thriving in what they're doing. We have people who can stand up as philanthropists without any special interest, but to just show that I want to contribute to development through the provision of quality information. And there is a radio station, there is a community radio. How often do we have that? We have people coming with its interest media. Politicians, business people, all these, but how often do we see media being supported by African philanthropists themselves saying we are ready to do this, not for our own good, but for the good of the country or the community. And all these things are reflections on the way forward to ensure that we continue to develop Africa. I think the world has opened our eyes. Recent developments continue to show us that Africans should work for themselves. Let us work to be self-sufficient in every area, and media is one of them.
Very well. You talk about climate change, and then there are people in communities that they feel the activities which is one hindering or causing devastation to the environment is their daily bread. And so you talk about climate change, they feel you witch hunting them. For example, the quest for galamsey, i.e. good for digging for gold, destroying the environment, i.e. water bodies, and then the forest reserves. In terms of policy-wise, how should there be a consensus from politicians, radio people, or media people, and then the indigents, so that they all understand that climate change issues is something which is actually for all of us, and therefore it is not a witch hunt?
In my own humble way, I think it is what is happening in our different countries. I don't blame, but I think the issue of governance should be really looked at. All these issues are happening. Most of the underlying factors, if we look at it, we say poverty. How do we address the issues of poverty? How do we develop our countries and our people to the extent that they wouldn't go they wouldn't need to even go and be in the issue on the issue of Galamsey.
Agnes Tomasi, WADR's station director. Up next is sports news with Sankule Janko.
Hello there, warm welcome and thank you for joining us. The Confederation of African Football CAF conducted the final draw for the CAF Under-20 Africa Cup of Nations Côte d'Ivoire 2025 on Thursday at the CAF headquarters in Cairo, Egypt. The tournament set to take place from 26 April to 18 May 2025 will feature 13 teams competing for continental glory and 4 qualification spots for the FIFA Under-20 World Cup Chile 2025 according to the CAF official website. Nigeria's Flying Eagles will play in Group B, where they will face former champions Egypt and Morocco as well as South Africa. In Group A, host Côte d'Ivoire will take on DR Congo, Ghana, Tanzania, and a second representative from UNIFAC region. Group C sees Senegal begin their title defense against Zambia, Kenya, and Sierra Leone. The top 2 teams from each group will qualify for the quarterfinals along with the 2 best third-place teams, from where the tournament will proceed in a knockout format, culminating in the final on 18 May 2025. Meanwhile, CAF also conducted the final draw for the Under-17 Africa Cup of Nations on Thursday. The youth competition set to be contested by 16 African nations between 30 March to 19 April 2025 in Morocco. The draw outcome saw tournament host Morocco headlining an interesting Group A consisting of Uganda, Tanzania, and Zambia. Algeria, Burkina Faso will be up against UNIFAC 1 champions of UNIFAC qualifiers, South Africa as well as former champions Egypt in Group B. And reigning champions Senegal will kick off their title defense in Group C against 2009 winners Gambia, Somalia and Tunisia. And that's it for sports. It's back to you.
Sports is brought to you by Sankule Janko. And with that, we've come to the end of this edition of Newslink here on West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting from Dakar, Senegal. Thank you for listening, and many thanks to Maojo Juf and Umu Daniego for the technical support. Do interact with us via social media platforms, X, Instagram at WADR English, on Facebook, WADR English Service, and stream live on WADR.org. Coming up at the bottom of the hour is WADR's security program in the Sahel. I'm Abdullahi Hassan. Good evening.
And many thanks to you for listening to Newslink via Hot 104.3 FM, New Me FM 94.